June 1900, Havana, Cuba. In a military hospital on the edge of the city, a U.S. Army doctor named Jesse Lazear walks between rows of cots, holding a small glass tube. Inside the tube is a mosquito. He lifts the cloth from a patient burning with fever, presses the open mouth of the tube against the man's skin, and waits for the insect to feed. Then he carries the tube out into the heat, alive, and keeps it. To almost everyone in Havana that summer, what Lazear was doing made no sense. Yellow fever was killing American soldiers by the hundreds, faster than any battle had, and every doctor with a reputation knew why. It was the filth. It was the bad air rising off the harbor, and the gutters and the dead. You did not catch yellow fever from an insect. You caught it from a place. A man who spent his afternoons feeding mosquitoes on the sick was, in the professional opinion of the time, wasting the little effort a doctor could give. He was not wasting it, but it would cost him his life to find out, and the answer he helped prove had already been printed in Havana 19 years earlier by a man everyone had agreed to ignore. Start with the war, because the war is why the army was there. In 1898, the United States fought Spain over Cuba and won it quickly. The fighting lasted a few months. The dying did not stop when the fighting did. American troops stayed on the island to occupy it, and the island had a resident that killed more of them than the Spanish army ever had. Yellow fever. It came every summer, it favored newcomers, and the men shipped in from the United States were exactly that. They had never been exposed. They had no defense. Camp after camp reported the same thing. A soldier was healthy at breakfast, feverish by night, yellow in the eyes within days, and in the worst cases, bringing up black blood before the end. The disease had a rhythm the army could see but not explain. It did not spread the way you would expect a filth disease to spread. A nurse could tend a dying man for a week and stay well. A soldier who never went near the sick ward could fall ill anyway. It moved through a barracks in a pattern no one could map. Whole households would be spared, while a man 3 streets over, who had touched nothing, died. The theory of filth and foul air could not account for that pattern, but it was the theory everyone had, so everyone kept it. Now the first loop. Hold this question, because the whole story turns on it. If the cause was not filth and not the air, then what was carrying yellow fever from the dying to the healthy in a pattern no one could trace? One man in Havana had already answered. His name was Carlos Finlay. He was Cuban, trained partly in the United States, a physician in his 60s by 1900, and he had been saying the same thing for almost 20 years. In 1881, at a scientific meeting, Finlay stood up and argued that yellow fever was not spread by dirt or by air at all. It was spread by a mosquito, a specific mosquito, one that bred in clean standing water around houses, the kind later identified as Aedes aegypti. The insect bit a person sick with the fever, carried something in its body, and bit a healthy person later, and that was the bridge the disease crossed. Finlay did more than argue it. He ran experiments. Over the years, he let his mosquitoes bite volunteers, trying to give people the fever on purpose, and he published his results. But his experiments did not come out clean. Some of the people he tried to infect got sick, and some did not. And the ones who did often could not be told apart from people who might have caught the fever the ordinary way, out in a city full of it. He did not know, because no one knew yet, that the timing had to be exact. The mosquito had to bite a patient in the first days of illness, then wait about 2 weeks for the germ to develop inside it before its bite could pass anything on. Get the timing wrong, and nothing happens. Finlay got it wrong often enough that his own evidence looked weak. So the medical world did what medical worlds do, with an idea that is ahead of its proof. It filed him away as a crank. For nearly 2 decades, he was the Mosquito Man, the Havana doctor with the strange fixed theory, invited to speak and then quietly dismissed. He kept publishing. He kept the mosquito eggs. He was, by most accounts, unfailingly polite about being ignored. And he was right, and no one with power believed him, and the soldiers kept dying. That is the second loop, and it stays open a long time. Remember Finlay. Remember that the answer existed in print in the same city before the American doctors ever arrived. In 1900, the U.S. Army decided to settle the question for itself. It formed a board of medical officers and sent them to Cuba with one job: find out what causes yellow fever and how it spreads. The board had 4 men. The head of it was Major Walter Reed, an Army surgeon in his late 40s, careful, well-trained, a man who had spent years studying infectious disease. Under him were 3 others: James Carroll, a bacteriologist, English-born, who had come up through the enlisted ranks the hard way; Aristides Agramonte, a Cuban-American doctor, who had likely already survived yellow fever as a boy, which meant he could work among the sick without much personal risk; and Jesse Lazear, the youngest, a surgeon in his early 30s, who had studied mosquitoes and who kept the tubes. They started by chasing the theory everyone believed. They looked for a bacterium, a germ in the blood, or the filth that could be the cause. They did not find one that held up. Meanwhile, Lazear, who had read Finlay and taken him seriously, pushed the board to test the mosquito. Reed, to his credit, agreed it was worth doing. Finlay himself, still in Havana, still waiting, handed the Americans his eggs and his notes and told them how to raise the insects. The man who had been mocked for 20 years gave his rivals everything they needed to prove him right. Here, the story turns dark, and it turns fast. The board decided that the only honest way to test the mosquito was to test it on human beings, because yellow fever, as far as anyone then knew, did not infect animals. There was no way around it. To prove that a bite could give a man the fever, you had to let a mosquito bite a man. The doctors agreed that they would not ask anyone to run a risk they would not run first. They would experiment on themselves. In late summer of 1900, they began. Lazear raised the mosquitoes, fed them on fever patients, and let them bite members of the team. For a while, nothing happened, because the timing was still not understood. Then it began to work. James Carroll was bitten by an infected mosquito in late August. Within days, he was gravely ill with yellow fever. He was one of the first people ever infected by a mosquito under something like controlled conditions, and it nearly killed him. He survived, but he was never fully well again. Then came Jesse Lazear. What happened to Lazear is the one place in this story where the record itself is uncertain, and it deserves to be told carefully, without invention. The official account written at the time said that Lazear was bitten by accident, that a mosquito landed on him while he was working in the fever ward, and he let it finish rather than disturb his work. His own notebook and the memory of the men around him suggest something else, that Lazear, knowing what the bite might do, may have allowed himself to be infected on purpose, as part of the experiment the board had agreed to run on their own bodies. The truth of that moment cannot be recovered now. What is certain is the result. In September 1900, Jesse Lazear developed yellow fever. He suffered through the stages the board had watched in so many others, and on the 25th of September, he died, in Cuba, a young man, far from home. His death did 2 things. It closed part of one loop. because the mosquito had now killed one of the doctors, and there was no longer any doubt in the board about what they were dealing with. And it opened a new weight over everything that came after, because the men now knew exactly and personally what they were asking of anyone else. Walter Reed had been in the United States when Lazear died. He came back to Cuba and read Lazear's notes, and he understood that the young surgeon's records, kept right up to the illness, pointed clearly at the mosquito, but scattered infections among the doctors were not proof. A skeptic could still say the men had caught the fever the ordinary way, from the filthy city all around them. To answer that, Reed needed something no one had done before. He needed a clean experiment, sealed off from the city, that could separate the two theories completely, the mosquito against the filth, head to head, on purpose, with nothing left to chance. In November of 1900, the board built it. They cleared a site on a farm outside Havana, well away from any town, and put up a small camp of tents and 2 plain wooden buildings. They named the place Camp Lazear, after the man who had died. Everyone who lived and worked there was screened and quarantined, so that no one could bring the fever in from outside. Whatever happened inside that camp would have only one possible source, and the doctors would control it. Then they designed 2 tests, and the 2 tests are the heart of everything. The first building was made to be filthy. This was the theory the whole medical world believed, and Reed set out to test it as hard as he could. The doctors took sheets, blankets, pillowcases, and nightclothes that had been used by yellow fever patients, soiled with the vomit, sweat, and waste of men who had died of the disease. They packed these into one of the small houses and sealed it. The windows were shut. There was no ventilation. Whatever foul air a filth disease was supposed to travel on, this room was full of it. And into that room, they sent volunteers to sleep. Not for 1 night, for 20 nights. The men unpacked the soiled bedding, made their beds with it, and lay down in it in the dark, night after night, in air thick enough to sicken a strong man on smell alone. The second building was different. It was clean. It was well aired, screened, kept spotless. But it was divided down the middle by a wire mesh screen, and on one side of that screen, the doctors released mosquitoes. Mosquitoes that had bitten yellow fever patients at the right moment, and then waited the right number of days. Volunteers on the mosquito side of the screen were bitten. Volunteers on the clean side, protected by the mesh, breathed the same air and were not bitten. Same building, same air. One difference: the insect. Now hold the 2 rooms side by side, because the result is the whole answer. The men in the filthy building, sleeping 20 nights in the soiled clothing and bedding of the dead, in sealed and stinking air, did not get yellow fever. Not one of them. They were miserable. They were disgusted. Some of them could barely stand the smell. And they stayed well. The theory that every important doctor in the world had held for a century, the theory of filth and foul air, was tested about as brutally as a theory can be tested, and it produced nothing. The men who were bitten got sick. That was it. That was the proof. A man could sleep for 3 weeks in the filth of the dead and walk out healthy. A man could sleep in a clean, aired room and take a few mosquito bites and come down with yellow fever within days. The disease did not travel in the dirt or the air. It traveled in the insect, exactly as Carlos Finlay had said in 1881 to a room full of experts who had laughed him off. There is a detail here that matters, and it is easy to rush past. The volunteers at Camp Lazear knew what they were agreeing to. The board did something that was rare for its time, and is one of the reasons this experiment is still studied. Reed had the volunteers sign written agreements, in Spanish and in English, that spelled out the risk in plain language. The papers told them they might get yellow fever. They told them the fever could kill them. Some of the volunteers were American soldiers. Some were Spanish immigrants newly arrived in Cuba, exactly the kind of newcomer the fever preferred. They were offered money, and more than the money, most of them seemed to have understood that they were part of something that might stop the disease from killing others. These signed consent forms are among the earliest known in the history of medicine. Men agreed, in writing, with their eyes open, to let a doctor try to give them a disease that had just killed one of the doctors. Not all of them lived. Write that plainly, and leave it plain. People died to prove this, and they died knowing it could happen. The most remembered of them came a little later. In 1901, after the main experiments, further tests were run to learn more about the fever and to work toward a way to protect people from it. Among the volunteers was a nurse named Clara Maass. She was American, in her mid-20s, and she had already worked among yellow fever patients. She volunteered to be bitten. She got the fever, and she survived it once. Then, for reasons tied to the questions the doctors were still trying to answer, she was exposed again. The second time, in August of 1901, the fever killed her. She was 25 years old. The deaths in the yellow fever experiments were few in number, but they were real people, and hers is the name most often spoken when people count the cost. There is one more thing the two rooms settled, and it is worth stating on its own. For a century, doctors had told families that the way to survive an outbreak was to flee the filth, to burn the bedding, to open the windows against the bad air. All of that advice was aimed at nothing. The soiled room proved that a healthy man could sleep in the worst filth the fever produced and take no harm from it. The clean room proved that a screen of wire mesh, a barrier against one insect, was the only thing that mattered. A century of confident instruction, carried out by good doctors trying to save lives, had been pointed at the wrong target the entire time. The experiment did not just find the cause, it cleared away everything people had believed instead. The public reaction to the deaths, and to the whole idea of paying men to be given a deadly disease, was not all admiration. There was anger in the newspapers. There were people who called it monstrous, who said no result was worth infecting a healthy man on purpose. That argument never fully went away, and it should not. But the result was now beyond dispute, and the result was about to save more lives than the fever had ever taken. Here the story shifts one more time, from the laboratory to the city. And this is where the proof turned into rescue. Knowing the cause is not the same as curing the disease. There was no cure for yellow fever in 1900, and there would not be one for decades. But you do not always need a cure. If the mosquito was the bridge, you did not have to fix the sick. You had to break the bridge. You had to kill the mosquitoes, or take away the places they bred, and the chain would stop. The man who did it was another army doctor, William Gorgas, the chief sanitary officer in Havana. Gorgas had spent years fighting yellow fever the old way, cleaning streets and scrubbing filth, and getting nowhere, because the old way was aimed at the wrong enemy. When Reed's board proved the mosquito, Gorgas changed his entire campaign. He knew the insect bred in clean, still water, the kind that collects in barrels, cisterns, gutters, and open containers around houses. So he went after the water. His crews covered water tanks, poured oil on standing pools to smother the larvae, drained what could be drained, and screened the houses of the sick so no infected mosquito could feed on them and carry the fever onward. The effect was almost immediate, and it was staggering. Havana had lived with yellow fever for as long as anyone could remember. Within about a year of Gorgas going after the mosquito instead of the filth, the disease that had killed American soldiers by the hundreds all but vanished from the city. A place that had buried its dead every summer for generations went nearly a full year without a single yellow fever death. Not because anyone had cured the sick, because the bridge was gone. And that is where this small experiment on a farm outside Havana becomes one of the largest engineering stories in the world. Close the loops now, one at a time. The United States wanted to build a canal across Panama, cutting the isthmus so ships would no longer have to sail around all of South America. France had tried it before, in the 1880s, and failed, and one of the great reasons France failed was disease. Yellow fever and malaria had killed the French workers in enormous numbers, thousands upon thousands of them, until the project collapsed. The jungle, everyone said, could not be beaten. The place was simply deadly. When the Americans took up the canal a few years into the new century, they sent William Gorgas. And Gorgas did in Panama what he had done in Havana. He treated the mosquito as the enemy. He drained, oiled, screened, and cleared the breeding water across the work zone, for yellow fever and for malaria both. Yellow fever was driven out of the canal zone. The workforce that the French had lost to fever survived. The Panama Canal, one of the hardest things human beings had ever built, was finished in 1914, and it was finished in part because 4 doctors on a farm outside Havana had proved, with their own bodies and the bodies of men who trusted them, that the killer was an insect and not the air. Now the last loop, the one that has been open since the beginning. Carlos Finlay had said all of this in 1881. He had named the mosquito, described how it carried the fever, and been dismissed for nearly 20 years as a man with a fixed idea and weak evidence. He was still alive when Reed's board proved him right. He lived on in Havana into the new century, honored at last, given credit by Reed and others who knew exactly whose theory they had confirmed. He had handed the Americans his eggs and his notes, without jealousy, and he lived to see the disease he had studied his whole life pushed out of his own city. He died in 1915, an old man, in the Havana he had tried for decades to save. Walter Reed did not live to see most of it. He died in 1902, not of yellow fever, but of a burst appendix, at the age of 51, only a couple of years after the experiments that carry the board's name. James Carroll, who had nearly died from the first mosquito bite, never fully recovered his health and died a few years later. Jesse Lazear was already gone, buried by the fever in September of 1900. His notebook, the quiet record that pointed the way. Clara Maass was gone too, at 25. A hospital in Cuba was later named for her, and one in the United States, so that the name of a nurse who let herself be bitten twice would not be lost. The men in the filthy room, the ones who slept 20 nights in the bedding of the dead, mostly walked away healthy and are mostly forgotten, and their comfort was proof of something. They proved a negative. They proved that the thing the whole world was afraid of, the foul air and the soiled sheets, could do nothing at all. That was as important as the men who fell sick. There is a reason the world had believed the wrong thing for so long. Filth and bad air were things you could see and smell and blame. A mosquito was small, common, everywhere, and harmless-looking, one of 1,000 insects in a Havana summer. The truth was too small to notice, and the false answer was right in front of the nose. It took a Cuban doctor who was willing to be laughed at for 20 years, and an army board willing to test the idea on its own flesh, and a sanitary officer willing to throw out everything he thought he knew, to make the world look at the insect instead of the air. Carlos Finlay had been right the whole time.